This year, my kids decided they really wanted to do an advent calendar for the month of December. And the one that they really wanted was from World Market, and it was $100. So instead of paying that price, I decided to make my own out of 1x4s and a sheet of thin plywood. And it cost me under $25 to make this. I'll put the material list and the cut list down below. And I did use a planer, which I know a lot of other people will not have. If you don't have a planer, you can just sand down your boards, or you can use a hand planer, whatever's easiest. So let's get started. I'll show you what I did. Using the table saw, I cut my plywood down to 23¼ inches wide. Then I moved to the miter saw and I cut it to just a little over the height I wanted, so about 25¾ inches. To minimize tear out, I put the blade in just as far as I needed it to go, not all the way. Then I cut 45s to make the top of my advent calendar. I used a square just to draw a straight line, and then went over and used the bandsaw to cut the rest of that line straight. You could use a jigsaw or a handsaw. I used the bandsaw to cut my 1x4s in half. Now the boards that I did for the project, I did in 4-foot lengths. I just forgot to do a video on it, so I'm doing this now. Then I marked the side that I cut with pencil and ran the boards through the planer just to get them all to the same thickness. And I ran them through until all of the pencil marks were gone, just to make sure that I had a straight line, not the jagged cut from the bandsaw. I used the miter saw to cut my boards down to size. Now I did these one board at a time just to make sure that it fit in the project correctly. When I went to the dividers, I did actually cut those just all together. I set up a stop and cut all those, but all of the other boards I cut to fit. I stained the project with Minwax Provincial Stain, and when I got to the inner pieces, I made sure that any area that I was going to be gluing that I did not stain, just to make sure that the glue would stick and hold better. To start assembling the project, I started first with the outer frame. I glued each piece one at a time and used clamps to hold it in place. Tried to remove all of the glue squeeze out, since that would be something that would be hard to clean out later. And I used the shelves just to make sure that I was getting the spacing correct, and then I used the clamps to hold it tight in place while I put it together. And using a 1/16 drill bit, I pre-drilled just a really small entry hole so that it gave direction for the nail. And then I used 5/8 inch nails and nailed them in just to hold everything in tight. Between the glue and the nails, everything should hold in there pretty well. Now when I did the top pieces, I actually flipped the project over just to make it easier, because it would be too hard to have to flip it over and keep those pieces in tight. I pre-assembled the first shelf just because it had the long piece at the end, and I wanted to make sure that I could get that nailed together. And if it was in the project, it'd be too hard to do. As I put the project together, I used the dividers just as a guide, just to make sure that I was getting it to the right thickness or the right spot in there, and make sure that my boards were level as I clamped them together. And I drilled and nailed the sides of every shelf. I just repeated this process for all the rest of the shelves. For the top shelf, I put it in place, and then I used my tape measure just to make sure that both sides were in the exact same spot. Next, I went through and I made sure that all the dividers were in the right spot and lined up both horizontally and vertically. And then I just did the layout of what I wanted, where I wanted each of the cubbies to be. Now, it would have been nice to have used a square on each one of these just to make sure that the front and the back of the dividers were in the right spot, but I didn't have a square that would fit in there, so I just did the best that I could. Once I got everything to where I wanted it, I went back through and I glued in all of the dividers that were just a little bit loose. Some of mine fit really snug, and I didn't even bother to glue them. Now, if they become loose over time or they start to fall out, then of course I'll go back and glue them in. And I touched up any areas that I didn't stain. I used the Cricut Design Space to create the numbers that will go in the cubbies. Then I printed out my vinyl numbers and I placed them in the cubbies.